There's an underground community of hardcore Disney pin collectors, and among them, a whispered legend. The final pin. No one knows exactly what it looks like or where it can be found, but the story goes that anyone who collects every Disney pin ever made gets a visit. Some say that it's a reward from Disney, and others claim that it's a curse. Tim wasn't one to believe in ghost stories, but he was obsessed with completing his collection. For years, he traded, bought, and hunted down the rarest pins. His entire life revolved around finding that last pin to complete the set. Then, one night, he got a message from a private seller online. No name, no profile picture, just a cryptic note. I have what you're looking for. Midnight, behind Fantasyland. Tim knew it was dangerous, but he couldn't resist. That final pin had eluded him for years, and now it was within his reach. At midnight, Tim found himself walking down a narrow alley, far from the bright lights and cheerful music of the park. The further he went, the quieter it became. By the time he reached the back of Fantasyland, only the sound of his own footsteps were echoing in the darkness. A figure stood at the end of an alley, draped in shadows, wearing what looked like an old Disney cast member uniform. As Tim approached, the man stepped forward, revealing his face. His skin was pale, unnaturally smooth, and his eyes were like hollow black voids. No emotion, just emptiness.
You're looking for something special?
The man said in a voice that sounded like ground metal. Tim swallowed hard. Yeah, the last pin. Do you have it? The man didn't say anything. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, black velvet box. Opening it slowly, he revealed a pin unlike any Tim had ever seen. It was Mickey, but not the cheerful mascot everyone knew. This Mickey was twisted, his smile too wide, eyes too dark, with jagged lines etched into his face. It was as though someone had taken the familiar character and broken him, reshaping him into something wrong. Tim's instincts screamed at him to leave, but he couldn't. His obsession wouldn't let him. How much? He asked, his voice shaky. The man grinned, but his smile stretched too far, like his face was pulling apart.
It's free. A gift. All I ask is that you wear it.
Tim hesitated, but clipped the pin to his lanyard. The moment it touched him, he felt a cold, creeping sensation crawl across his skin. His head felt heavy, his vision blurred, but the man was gone. When he stumbled back to the hotel, everything was off. The colors of the park seemed darker, the air thicker, the music that had once been cheerful droned like a distant, warped carnival tune. That night, Tim fell into a deep, restless sleep, but it wasn't long before the nightmare began. He was in the park, but it was empty. The rides were rusted, the buildings decayed, and the sky hung overhead like a blood-stained sheet. Slowly, he made his way through the crumbling streets, passing familiar landmarks now twisted into grotesque versions of themselves. Cinderella's castle loomed overhead, but it was no longer magical. Its spires were black, jagged, and dripping with something dark and thick. A distant, high-pitched giggle echoed through the park, but growing closer. Mickey. Tim turned a corner and saw him standing in front of the castle, but it wasn't the Mickey he knew. This version was taller, his limbs elongated and thin, his black eyes staring without blinking, his mouth locked in a horrific, jagged grin that split his face. His white-gloved hands reached out, but the gloves were stained, red at the fingertips. Mickey? Tim stammered, his voice barely a whisper. Mickey's head twitched to the side in a series of unnatural jerking movements. His smile never wavered as he began to walk toward Tim, each step unnervingly slow, deliberate. His shoes made a sickening squish with each step, as if they were soaked in something wet. Behind Mickey, the other figures began to emerge from the shadows. Goofy, Pluto, Donald, each one warped beyond recognition. Goofy's mouth stretching down to his chest, his eyes wide and bloodshot, body twisted like a marionette on broken strings. Pluto's fur was matted, jaws unhinged, hanging loosely as a low growl rumbled from his chest. Donald's sailor outfit was stained, his feathers drenched in some dark, viscous substance, his eyes hollow and empty. They were all wrong. Horribly wrong. Tim tried to run, but his legs felt heavy, as though they were sinking into the pavement. Mickey reached him first, his gloved hand gently resting on Tim's shoulder, but the grip tightened. The glove peeled away, revealing long, sharp claws digging into his skin.
You wanted the final pin,
Mickey whispered, his voice distorted and broken.
Now you're part of the collection.
Tim screamed, but it was too late. He looked down and saw his skin turning gray, hardening like plastic. His limbs locked in place, and his body stiffened as the world around him spun and twisted. His screams became silent, trapped in his throat. Tim stood still, his body frozen, plastic and unyielding. His consciousness remained intact, but he couldn't move, couldn't speak. He was trapped inside a hollow shell, staring blankly ahead. In front of him, a massive display case slowly slid open, filled with dozens, no, hundreds of pins, each one more twisted and grotesque than the last. Faces frozen in torment, eyes wide in eternal horror. A pair of white-gloved hands lifted him from where he stood, placing him carefully onto the velvet interior of the case. He felt himself being arranged, adjusted, until he fit perfectly among the other pins. The glass case closed with a faint click, sealing him inside the collection forever. As Mickey's dark figure faded into the shadows, Tim's mind screamed. But there was no escape. His hubris had led him here, and now he was just another piece in the display. Jake wasn't into Disney pins, but Emily insisted he start a collection. While wandering a forgotten, shadowy part of the park, they encountered an old cast member named Mr. Wilkins. His uniform faded, his smile unsettling. "I've got something rare for you," he said, pulling out a tarnished castle pin. "One of a kind. Just trade me." Hesitant, Jake handed over one of his pins, but the moment the castle pin clipped to his lanyard, a deep chill ran throughout him. That night, strange things began to happen. The park felt wrong. Colors dimmed, familiar music slowed, and the characters seemed twisted, with darker eyes and jerkier movements. Back at the hotel, the castle pin seemed even darker, almost pulsating, as though something inside was alive. Suddenly, the TV flickered on. Mr. Wilkins appeared on the screen, his grin stretched unnaturally wide. "You started something you can't stop," he whispered. Terrified, Jake ripped the pin off and tossed it across the room. But when he turned back to his lanyard, the pin was there again, glinting ominously. The room itself began to warp, the walls shifting into the crumbling, forgotten corners of the park. Whispers filled the air, voices calling Jake's name growing louder, desperate. In the window's reflection, Jake's face wasn't his own anymore. It was Mr. Wilkins. Hollow eyes and lips stretched into a sickening grin. Emily woke the next morning to find Jake gone. His lanyard lay discarded on the floor, every pin twisted and blackened. As she picked it up, a new pin had appeared. A tarnished castle pin, identical to the one Jake had received. Without thinking, she attached it to her own lanyard. Just then, a cold shiver ran through her as the TV flickered on. Mr. Wilkins appeared, but this time, Jake stood behind him, smiling the same eerie, hollow smile. "Your turn," Jake said. In the sleepy town of Bright Hollow, there was a legend whispered among pin collectors. The existence of the pin beyond time. Said to be older than Disney itself, this pin supposedly appeared once in a lifetime to a collector chosen by forces beyond human comprehension. Unlike other pins, no one knew what it looked like. Some said it defied form, while others claimed it drove those who saw it mad. Gary, an avid collector with a growing obsession, had heard of the legend, but dismissed it as nonsense. One evening, while sorting through his vast collection, he received an anonymous package. Inside was a single pin, a shimmering, swirling mass of color that didn't seem to have any fixed shape. The sight of it made his stomach churn, but his hands trembled with excitement. He held it up to the light, but no matter how he turned it, the pin seemed to shift in and out of reality. He held it up to the light, but no matter how he turned it, the pin seemed to shift in and out of reality. It looked like Mickey Mouse, or a castle, or something else entirely, something his brain couldn't comprehend. Against every instinct screaming in his mind, Gary attached it to his jacket. The moment the pin touched his skin, the air in the room grew thick and oppressive. The lights flickered and a faint hum vibrated in the walls, like the pulse of something ancient and alive. Gary's head began to ache, and his vision blurred. He felt a cold breeze, though every window was shut. Shadows stretched and twisted unnaturally, and soon they began to move on their own. The world around him felt wrong, like reality itself was peeling away. Stumbling out of his house, Gary found the town empty. The streets were silent, the sky unnervingly dark, and the familiar outlines of buildings seemed warped. The stars overhead swirled in impossible patterns, twisting into shapes his mind couldn't grasp. As he walked, the pin on his jacket pulsed, sending waves of nausea through him. The world around him began to fold inward, and strange figures appeared in the distance. They were tall, featureless beings, their forms vaguely humanoid but distorted, like reflections in broken glass. They stood still at first, watching. Then, they moved closer, faster than anything should be able to move. Their whispers filled Gary's mind, words and languages he had never heard but somehow understood. The pin, the eternal cycle, the collector. Gary tried to pull the pin off, but it had fused to his skin, digging deep into his chest. His thoughts fractured. Was he still in his town? Was he even in the same universe? Time ceased to have meaning as the figures closed in. They weren't just in front of him now, they were everywhere, surrounding him, their shapes twisting in ways that defied physics. Their whispers became louder. With each step they took, Gary's mind unraveled further. He stumbled backward, and the ground gave way beneath him. He fell into the void, surrounded by the swirling, incomprehensible cosmos. Above him, the pin's image grew larger, filling his vision. It was no longer a simple trinket, it was an eye, a massive, all-seeing eye, peering into his very soul, into the fabric of existence itself. The whispers became a roar, and Gary realized the horrifying truth. The pin wasn't a collector's item. It was a cosmic beacon, a mark that connected him to something far older and far darker than anything he had ever imagined. He was now part of a vast, incomprehensible collection, one of infinite realities, each being twisted by forces beyond understanding. The figures reached for him, their hands merging with the void. As they touched him, he felt his body disintegrate, his consciousness stretched thin across the cosmos. He wasn't dying. No, that would have been merciful. He was being added to the collection, his essence trapped forever in the infinite archive of the pin beyond time. In a distant corner of the universe, a new pin materialized in a collector's box. Its form was impossible, shifting and twisting in ways that made the eyes water and the mind reel. But to the next collector who found it, it would seem irresistible, and the cycle would begin again.